Jerome Hayes, the first black police chief of Brenton, was on his way back home, driving his prized navy blue sedan. It was a peaceful afternoon, and nothing suggested that danger was looming just ahead. Little did Jerome know, in a matter of moments, he would face a life-threatening encounter with men he thought he could trust. What happened next would leave him questioning everything. As always, remember to subscribe and comment with your thoughts on where you're watching from. Jerome had just returned from a much-needed vacation. The winding countryside road stretched endlessly in front of him, lined by dense, towering trees on either side. The late afternoon sun bathed everything in a warm, amber glow. Despite the long drive, Jerome felt a soothing sense of comfort settle over him. Returning to Brenton always gave him a unique peace, and the tranquil surroundings offered him a chance to gather his thoughts. He reflected on the challenges awaiting him at the Brenton Police Department. As the first black police chief in the town's history, Jerome had faced resistance at every turn. Earning the trust of his officers and the community had been no small feat. He had worked tirelessly to prove his competence and fairness, overcoming both overt and subtle prejudices. Now, after some time away, Jerome felt ready to take on his duties with a renewed sense of purpose. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, but Jerome ignored it, keeping his eyes on the quiet road ahead. The steady hum of the engine and the absence of traffic made for a calming atmosphere, but the serenity didn't last. Suddenly, a car shot past him on the left, narrowly missing his front bumper. Jerome's instincts kicked in as he slammed on the brakes and tightened his grip on the steering wheel, swerving slightly to avoid a collision. His heart raced as the vehicle sped recklessly down the road, weaving dangerously between lanes. "What on earth is this guy doing?" Jerome muttered under his breath, his brief moment of calm replaced by a surge of adrenaline. The car in question, a beat-up black sedan, showed no signs of slowing. Instead, it continued its erratic movements, endangering everyone on the road. Jerome's sense of duty took over. He couldn't ignore such reckless behavior. Dressed in his uniform and with his badge sitting prominently on the passenger seat, Jerome decided to intervene. He pressed down on the accelerator, determined to catch up. The sedan in front of him swerved wildly, and as Jerome gained on it, he could see that this wasn't just a careless driver. This was someone actively disregarding the rules of the road and the safety of others. His jaw tightened. This kind of reckless law-breaking was exactly what he had spent his career fighting against. Flipping on his police lights, Jerome signaled for the car to pull over. The black sedan slowed, veering abruptly onto the gravel shoulder. Jerome followed, his own vehicle skidding slightly as it came to a halt behind the other car. Stepping out of his vehicle, Jerome's boots crunched against the gravel. His heart was still pounding, a mix of adrenaline and frustration coursing through him. As he approached the sedan, the door swung open and two men emerged. Jerome's eyes widened in disbelief. Both men were in uniform, officers from the Brenton Police Department. "What's your problem?" one of them barked, stepping aggressively toward Jerome. The second officer followed close behind, a hostile expression etched across his face. Jerome held his ground, though every instinct told him that this encounter was about to take a dangerous turn. "I could ask you the same thing," Jerome replied calmly, his voice firm. "You nearly caused a serious accident back there." The officers exchanged a glance before letting out mocking laughs. "And who do you think you are?" The first one sneered, stepping closer. Jerome's pulse quickened. He could tell they hadn't recognized him. "I'm Jerome Hayes," he said, maintaining his composure. "Chief of Police." The laughter stopped, but the tension only thickened. "Chief of Police?" the first officer said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Right, and I'm the governor." Jerome's sharp gaze didn't waver. He knew where this was heading. "Listen, you're making a mistake," he said firmly. But neither man was interested in listening. Instead, their smirks widened, their hostility now undeniable. Jerome braced himself, realizing too late that the men he had trusted to uphold the law were about to show just how far they were willing to go to break it. "I could ask you the same thing," Jerome Hayes replied evenly, keeping his voice controlled. "You nearly caused a serious accident back there." The two officers exchanged a glance before letting out cold, mocking laughter. "And who do you think you are?" The taller officer sneered, stepping closer, his tone dripping with disdain. Jerome glanced between them, taking in their arrogant smirks and dismissive stances. It didn't take much to see where this was headed. They hadn't recognized him. "I'm Jerome Hayes," he said, his tone firm but calm, "Chief of Police." For a fleeting moment, silence hung in the air. The officers stared at him, their expressions flickering with a brief hesitation as though they were beginning to piece things together. But then, the shorter one scoffed. "Chief of Police?" he jeered. "Right, and I'm the governor." Jerome's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. This wasn't the first time he had encountered this level of disrespect, but something about the escalating hostility in their demeanor set him on edge. "You're making a mistake," he warned, his voice steady. "I suggest you calm down." The shorter officer stepped forward, his hand resting on the belt at his waist, his expression twisted into one of open contempt. "We don't take kindly to people like you trying to act like they're in charge," he spat. Jerome's jaw tightened. He raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp. "People like me?" He didn't need an explanation to know exactly what the officer meant. "Yeah," the taller officer chimed in with a smug grin. "People like you." Before Jerome could respond, the taller officer lunged forward, shoving him hard in the chest. The force sent Jerome staggering back a step, caught off guard by the sudden aggression. "Back off," Jerome said, his voice commanding, but his words were met with nothing but contempt. The shorter officer joined in, delivering another shove, this one harder, sending Jerome sprawling backward onto the gravel. His hands scraped against the rough ground as he tried to steady himself. Jerome's mind raced. He couldn't believe what was happening. These weren't just random men, they were his officers. Men sworn to uphold the law under his leadership. But in their eyes, he wasn't their chief. To them, he was just another black man, someone they felt entitled to dominate and humiliate. Before he could rise, a sharp, searing pain shot through his side as the shorter officer delivered a brutal kick to his ribs. Jerome groaned, clutching his side as the agony spread through his body. "You're gonna regret messing with us," the taller officer snarled, towering over Jerome with a menacing glare. Jerome gasped for air, the pain making it nearly impossible to breathe. He raised a hand in a weak attempt to shield himself. "Stop," he rasped, his voice strained. "I'm your boss, I'm the chief." But his words fell on deaf ears. The beating continued. Each blow landed harder than the last, and with every hit, Jerome felt his strength slipping away. This wasn't just an attack. It was an attempt to utterly humiliate and dehumanize him. As he lay on the ground, battered and bruised, Jerome's chest heaved with shallow, agonizing breaths. The pain in his ribs made each inhale feel like knives stabbing into his lungs. How did it come to this? He thought, disbelief swirling in his mind. How could his own men have attacked him with such brutality? The taller officer grabbed Jerome roughly by the collar and yanked him upward. "Get up," the officer barked, his face twisted with rage. Jerome tried to find his footing, his legs shaky beneath him, but before he could fully stand, the shorter officer stepped forward. A vicious punch to the stomach sent Jerome doubling over, gasping for air as his vision blurred from the pain. "I told you," Jerome wheezed, his voice barely audible. "I'm the chief of police." But the officers weren't interested in listening. The taller officer laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed in the stillness of the road. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he sneered. With a hard shove, the taller officer sent Jerome stumbling backward until his body collided with the side of his car. The impact rattled through his already battered frame, leaving him gasping for breath as the pain from his ribs intensified. Jerome's mind raced, but his body was too weakened to respond. He could barely comprehend the depths of betrayal as he faced the cold, mocking faces of the two men who were supposed to serve under him. "Chief of Police? Sure you are," sneered Officer Grant, circling Jerome Hayes like a predator. His hand rested ominously on the baton strapped to his belt, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "You're just a punk who thinks he can play the hero. But guess what? Heroes pay the price, and it's your turn." Jerome's chest pounded with fear and adrenaline. Every breath sent sharp jolts of pain through his bruised ribs, and his throbbing arm left his thoughts scattered. He could feel the fight-or-flight instinct surging within him, but he knew that fighting back would only worsen the situation. These men weren't acting out of duty or reason. They were driven by unchecked hatred and arrogance. "Listen," Jerome rasped, his voice shaky but resolute. "You're making a mistake. You don't understand who you're dealing with." Grant rolled his eyes, stepping closer. His face was mere inches from Jerome's as he hissed, "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with. Another nobody who thinks they can boss us around." His lip curled into a sneer. "You're lucky we haven't hauled you in already." The words carried a menacing weight, and Jerome knew the threat was anything but idle. He could see the unchecked rage in their eyes, rage that was ready to spill over into more violence. Before Jerome could respond, the second officer, Harper, grabbed his arm with a roughness that made Jerome wince. Harper twisted it behind Jerome's back, and a sickening crack rang out. A blinding surge of pain shot through Jerome's body, forcing a scream from his throat as he staggered forward. "Still want to play chief of police?" Harper sneered, tightening his grip until Jerome thought his arm might snap completely. Jerome clenched his teeth, fighting against the overwhelming pain. "I am the chief," he managed to say through gritted teeth, but his words only seemed to spur them on. With one final, brutal twist, Harper wrenched Jerome's arm, and the sickening sound of a break echoed in the quiet night. Jerome collapsed to his knees, his broken arm hanging limply at his side. Agony blurred his vision, and all he could focus on was the unbearable pain coursing through him. Grant loomed over him, looking down with a smug expression. "Guess you won't be needing that arm anymore," he said coldly. "Let that be a lesson about getting in our way." But the officers weren't done yet. Harper stepped away from Jerome and walked toward his car, a sleek silver sedan that Jerome had worked tirelessly to buy. Harper eyed the car with disdain, running his fingers along the hood. "Nice ride," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Would be a real shame if something happened to it." Jerome's heart sank as the realization hit him. He knew what was coming next. "Don't," Jerome gasped, his voice weak but pleading. Harper ignored him, pulling a lighter from his pocket and flicking it open with a grin. "We don't usually torch cars," he said, his tone mockingly casual. "But for you, I'll make an exception." The tiny flame danced in the wind as Harper approached the car's fuel tank. He turned to look back at Jerome, still kneeling on the gravel, too injured to intervene. "This'll teach you not to mess with us," Harper said before tossing the lighter. In an instant, flames erupted from the car, spreading rapidly as they devoured the vehicle. Thick black smoke billowed into the air, the fire's heat searing Jerome's skin even from where he lay. Jerome watched in horror, powerless to stop the destruction. The car wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol of his hard work, his success, and the sacrifices he'd made. Now it was gone, reduced to ash by the very people who were supposed to serve under him. Grant and Harper stood back, watching the blaze with smug satisfaction. "Looks like your ride's done for," Grant said mockingly, his voice full of cruel amusement. Jerome couldn't tear his eyes away from the inferno. The loss of the car felt like a cruel metaphor for everything these men had taken from him. His authority, his dignity, and now a piece of his identity. But the officers weren't finished with their assault on Jerome or his spirit. Officer Grant yanked Jerome Hayes up by his shirt collar, his face twisted in a sadistic grin. "You thought you could stop us and just walk away?" he growled. With a forceful shove, Grant threw Jerome back to the ground, his head slamming against the gravel. For a moment, the world went dark. When Jerome's vision cleared, he saw Officer Harper crouched over him, rifling through his pockets. Harper smirked as he pulled out Jerome's wallet and phone. "Thanks for the cash," Harper sneered, waving a handful of bills in front of Jerome's face. "Consider this a toll for sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Pain throbbed through Jerome's battered body. His broken arm hung useless at his side, and every breath sent searing jolts through his ribs. They had taken everything, his car, his money, his phone, and even his dignity. Now, these men who were supposed to uphold the law were leaving him for dead. The two officers turned away, laughing as they strode back to their squad car. "Next time, don't try to be a hero," Grant called over his shoulder before climbing into the vehicle. Their engine roared to life and faded into the distance, leaving Jerome alone in the quiet, darkening forest. His body ached from the beating, and the heat from his burning car still lingered in the air, singeing his skin. Jerome lay motionless for a moment, every nerve screaming in pain, but his mind burned with something far stronger: determination. He would survive this. He would make sure Grant and Harper paid for what they'd done. Summoning every ounce of strength, Jerome forced himself onto his feet. His legs trembled beneath him, and his broken arm dangled at his side, but he began to walk. Each step sent waves of pain radiating through his body, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The road ahead was dark and winding, surrounded by dense woods on either side. The only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves in the wind and the crunch of gravel underfoot. Jerome was miles from town, injured, and with no way to call for help. He was utterly alone. But he pressed on. Each step felt heavier than the last as exhaustion clawed at him. His vision blurred from the pain, and his body wavered, threatening to collapse. Several times he stumbled, barely catching himself before falling. The cool night air stung his sweat-soaked skin, mingling with the dirt and blood that coated him. His clothes clung to his battered body, and his breaths came in shallow, labored gasps. Still, Jerome kept moving. The faint glow of the town's lights in the distance became his only focus. They were barely visible through the trees, and he estimated it would take hours to reach them on foot. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, but he couldn't afford to give up. As he trudged along the road, his mind raced with thoughts of the brutal attack. How could this have happened? How could two men under his command, officers sworn to serve and protect, turn on him with such cruelty? But Jerome knew the answer. They hadn't seen him as their superior. They hadn't even seen him as a man. To them, Jerome was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. His authority, his position as their chief, it didn't matter. All they saw was someone they believed they could dominate and humiliate. The realization ignited a fresh wave of anger inside him. Gritting his teeth, Jerome pushed forward, channeling his rage into each agonizing step. His entire life had been a battle against prejudice, but this was something different. This wasn't just professional disrespect or personal animosity. This was targeted and calculated. Grant and Harper hadn't just tried to hurt him, they had wanted to destroy him. But they had underestimated Jerome Hayes. As the distant lights of the town grew slightly brighter, Jerome's resolve hardened. He would not let them win. He would not let this injustice go unanswered. His journey back was far from over. But with every painful step, Jerome reminded himself why he had taken the job as Brenton's first black police chief. It was a fight against men like Grant and Harper. A fight to prove that justice, fairness, and equality could prevail even in the darkest moments. And Jerome Hayes was not about to lose that fight now. Jerome Hayes stumbled again, his knees buckling beneath him. His body screamed for relief, and as his legs gave out, he fell hard onto the gravel road. The sharp rocks tore at his palms, and the impact sent another searing jolt through his broken arm. For a moment he lay there, gasping for air, his vision blurred and swimming from exhaustion and pain. His mind shouted at him to move, to get up, to keep going, but his battered body refused to cooperate. He was utterly drained, lying alone on the cold, unforgiving ground. The chill of the night air cut through his torn clothing, and the gravel beneath him offered no comfort, only a harsh reminder of how far he still had to go. But he couldn't give up. Slowly, painfully, Jerome pushed himself onto his knees. His arms trembled as he forced himself upright, his legs wobbling under his weight. "I have to keep moving," he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "I have to." He had no idea how much time had passed since the attack. The sky above was an endless expanse of black, with only the faint glow of the distant town offering any sense of direction. Blood trickled down the side of his face, sticky and warm against his skin. Every shallow breath sent a fresh wave of pain shooting through his ribs, and his broken arm throbbed with relentless agony. But it was anger, raw and burning, that propelled him forward. Grant and Harper thought they'd gotten away with it. They thought they could leave him to die in the middle of nowhere and face no consequences. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Jerome Hayes wasn't just any man. He was their boss, and he would make sure they regretted every blow they had landed. The hours dragged on as Jerome trudged along the dark road. Each step felt heavier than the last, his body begging him to stop, but his mind refused to give in. His uneven footsteps scuffed against the gravel, his battered shoes barely keeping him upright. He tried to push away the haunting images of the burning car and the sneering faces of the officers who had left him for dead. Those memories threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced his focus forward, toward town, toward safety, toward justice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the faint outlines of Breton's outskirts came into view. The dim glow of streetlights pierced through the dense trees, guiding him closer to safety. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. Jerome knew his fight wasn't over. His legs trembled as he stepped onto the first street of the town. Familiar buildings and homes appeared, their shapes almost surreal through his haze of exhaustion. Each breath felt like a battle, and his body was on the verge of collapse. But Jerome pressed on, one agonizing step at a time. The police station was just a few blocks away, but the distance felt insurmountable. His focus narrowed, his mind clinging to a single thought. He had to reach the precinct. He needed to see his officers, to tell them what had happened, to demand justice. The station finally came into view, the brick building standing solemnly under the streetlights like a beacon of order. Jerome's heart raced as he stumbled toward the entrance, each step more excruciating than the last. His shaking hand reached for the door handle, his body screaming at him to stop, to rest. But his mind was unyielding. With a burst of effort, he shoved the door open and staggered inside. The brightly lit lobby felt jarringly out of place compared to the darkness and solitude of the road he had just endured. The officers behind the front desk looked up, their faces twisting in shock as they took in Jerome's disheveled appearance. His clothes were torn and bloodied, dirt smeared across his face, and his broken arm hung uselessly at his side. "Chief!" one of them exclaimed, jumping to his feet. His voice was laced with disbelief. Jerome ignored the stunned faces around him as he pushed forward, his body running purely on adrenaline. He didn't stop to answer their questions or explain. There was no time for that. He had made it back, but his mission was far from over. The fight for justice had just begun. Jerome Hayes' eyes locked on the hallway leading to his office, his voice hoarse but unyielding. "I need every available officer," he commanded, his tone cutting through the room like steel. The officers around him sprang into action, still reeling from the sight of their battered and bloodied chief. Jerome didn't have time to explain. He needed results, and he needed them fast. His body was screaming for rest, his broken arm hanging uselessly at his side, but his mind was razor sharp. He wouldn't stop until the men who had done this to him were brought to justice. Jerome staggered into his office, collapsing into the chair behind his desk. His breaths came in heavy, uneven gasps as pain surged through his chest and arm. The room swam before his eyes, and his vision blurred from exhaustion. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to stay conscious. He couldn't afford to let his injuries take him down. Not yet. The door to his office burst open, and several senior officers rushed in, their faces pale with concern. "Chief, what happened?" one of them asked, his voice tight with panic. Jerome steadied himself, drawing in a deep breath before replying. "I was attacked," he said coldly, his voice laced with fury, "by two of our own." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. The officers exchanged stunned glances, their shock palpable. "They thought they could get away with it?" Jerome continued, his voice steady despite the pain coursing through his body. "I want every available unit out there. Find them, bring them in, now." For a moment, the room remained frozen in silence. Then, one by one, the officers snapped into action, mobilizing with urgency. Jerome watched them leave, his body trembling from the effort of sitting upright. Pain racked his ribs and his broken arm, but the adrenaline coursing through him kept him going. His men would find Grant and Harper, and when they did, those two would face the consequences of their actions. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall punctuated the quiet as Jerome leaned back in his chair. His body was a battlefield of bruises, cuts, and broken bones. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through him, but he refused to rest. His mind replayed the events of the attack over and over. The sneers on Grant and Harper's faces, the malice in their eyes, it all made his blood boil. They had thought they could leave him for dead, confident in their arrogance and cruelty. They had underestimated him, and they would regret it. The hum of activity outside his office was constant. Radios crackled with orders, and boots thudded against the floors as officers geared up. The station buzzed with purpose, the entire force mobilized to track down their rogue colleagues. Jerome's door creaked open, and Lieutenant Daniel Harper stepped inside. The lieutenant's face was tight with worry as his eyes swept over Jerome's injuries. "Chief, we're ready," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with concern. "Patrols are covering all major roads and checkpoints. We've deployed units across the town and surrounding areas. We'll find them." Jerome nodded, his teeth clenched as he shifted in his chair, trying to find a position that eased the pain. "Good," he replied, his voice low but firm. "They think they can walk away from this. I want them found and brought here." Daniel hesitated, clearly uneasy. "Sir, are you sure you don't want to go to the hospital? You need medical attention. Your arm." Jerome waved him off, his expression hardening. "I'll deal with that later. Right now, those two are my priority." The lieutenant nodded, recognizing the resolve in his chief's voice. There was no point in arguing. "We'll get them, Chief," Daniel said with determination before turning to leave. As the door clicked shut, Jerome exhaled slowly, bracing himself against the pain. His body begged for rest, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. This wasn't over. He couldn't stop, not until those men were caught. The minutes crawled by like hours. Jerome sat in his chair, willing himself to stay focused as the adrenaline began to fade. The station's radios echoed with updates from the field, voices crackling through static as officers reported their positions and progress. Jerome leaned back, wincing as another sharp pain shot through his ribs. His gaze drifted to the clock, its steady ticking a reminder of the passing time. They thought they could silence him, break him. But Jerome Hayes was not a man who could be easily defeated. He would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. Several patrol cars combed through the quiet streets of Windale, checking side alleys, abandoned lots, and remote areas, but so far there was no sign of the two men. Jerome Hayes sat in his office, his eyes closed briefly as he tried to block out the pain radiating from his ribs and broken arm. He forced himself to focus. He knew Grant and Harper wouldn't stay in town. They were desperate men who understood what was coming for them. They were likely already planning their next move, but Jerome had made sure there was no easy way out. The door to his office swung open, snapping Jerome out of his thoughts. Officer Morales, a young but highly dependable member of his team, stepped inside. His face was grim, his radio buzzing faintly with chatter. "Chief," Morales began, stepping forward with urgency. "We just got a tip. Two individuals matching their description were spotted heading toward Pine Hollow Road on the outskirts of town." Jerome's heart raced. Pine Hollow Road? He knew it well. The narrow, isolated stretch ran parallel to the highway, flanked on both sides by dense forest. It was the perfect escape route, but also the ideal place for an ambush. "Send units there immediately," Jerome ordered, rising from his chair despite the sharp pain that shot through his side. Morales moved quickly to steady him, but Jerome waved him off, determined to stand on his own. "I want them cornered before they reach the highway," Morales nodded, speaking into his radio. "All units, this is Officer Morales. We have a possible location. Proceed to Pine Hollow Road near Highway 12. Suspects are armed and dangerous. Exercise caution." Jerome grabbed his jacket with his good hand and threw it over his shoulders. His jaw was set with determination. He wasn't about to sit back and let his team handle this alone. "Sir, you should really stay here," Morales said cautiously, concern etched on his face. Jerome's expression hardened, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'm going," he said firmly. "I'm not sitting this one out." Morales hesitated for a moment but quickly nodded, knowing it was futile to argue. "I'll drive," he offered. Jerome followed Morales out of the office, his steps slow but deliberate. The air in the station seemed to shift as every officer stopped to watch their chief pass by. Bruised, battered, and barely standing, Jerome's determination was a powerful sight. Their respect for him was evident, and it only fueled their collective resolve to bring Grant and Harper to justice. Morales led Jerome to the patrol car parked out front, opening the passenger door and helping him inside. Once Jerome was settled, Morales climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped off toward the outskirts of town. The atmosphere in the car was tense. The only sounds the hum of the engine and the crackle of the radio as updates poured in. Other patrol cars were already closing in on Pine Hollow Road, reporting their positions and progress. Jerome stared out at the dark road ahead, his mind racing. He wasn't sure how he would react when they finally caught up with Grant and Harper. But one thing was certain: they would face the full weight of justice. As the car neared the turnoff for Pine Hollow Road, the tension thickened. Morales slowed the vehicle as the headlights illuminated the dense woods on either side of the narrow path. Shadows stretched across the road, twisting ominously in the dark. "Looks like they're here," Morales said, pointing ahead. Several patrol cars were already parked along the side of the road, their flashing lights casting eerie blue and red hues against the trees. Officers fanned out cautiously, moving toward the forested area where the suspects had been spotted. Jerome's pulse quickened. Without hesitation, he pushed open the car door with his good hand and stepped out, ignoring the sharp pain that tore through his body. He couldn't let the pain stop him now. As he moved toward the other officers, Jerome's determination burned brighter than ever. Grant and Harper thought they could escape, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Jerome Hayes moved through the forest, his focus razor-sharp. He had only one goal: to confront the men who had tried to destroy him. Lieutenant Morales approached from the shadows, his expression tense with purpose. "We've got them cornered about half a mile in," Morales reported. "They tried to run, but we've got the area locked down." Jerome's jaw tightened, his determination overriding the pain in his body. "Good," he said firmly. "I want to be there when they're taken in." Morales hesitated, his eyes darting to Jerome's broken arm and battered frame. "Sir, maybe you should—" "I'm going." Jerome cut him off, his voice like steel. "I need to see this through." Without waiting for a response, Jerome followed Morales toward the line of officers moving carefully into the dense woods. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified by the tension. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves was unnervingly loud. Jerome's heart pounded as they pushed deeper into the trees, the dim glow of the patrol cars fading behind them. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing. There, in the shadows, huddled Grant and Harper. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. Several officers stood around them, weapons drawn, ready for any sudden movements. But the two men didn't resist. They knew the game was over. Jerome stepped forward, his gaze locked onto the men who had beaten him, humiliated him, and left him to die. Recognition flickered in their eyes, and for the first time, they seemed to truly understand who they had attacked. "You thought you could get away with this," Jerome said, his voice low and seething with controlled rage. "You thought you could leave me there, and no one would know." The two officers stared at him, their bravado stripped away, replaced by raw terror. They knew there was no escaping what was coming. Jerome turned to his men. "Take them in," he ordered. The officers moved swiftly, handcuffing Grant and Harper. As Jerome watched, a cold sense of satisfaction coursed through him. Justice was beginning to take shape, but he knew the night's events were far from over. Back at the Windale police station, Jerome sat behind his desk. The weight of the night pressed heavily on his shoulders, each bruise and broken bone a painful reminder of what had happened. His broken arm throbbed relentlessly, and every shallow breath sent fresh waves of pain through his ribs. But the physical agony was nothing compared to the seething anger burning inside him. Grant and Harper now sat in the holding cells, handcuffed and stripped of their badges. For hours they hadn't spoken a word, sitting in stunned silence as the gravity of their actions began to sink in. They hadn't just assaulted any man. They had attacked their own chief of police, the very person they had sworn to serve under. Jerome's officers had worked quickly, following his commands without hesitation. The rogue men had been arrested, processed, and confined in record time. Now, they awaited their fate. Jerome didn't care about their fear or regret. It wasn't enough, not after what they had done to him. Pushing himself to his feet, Jerome winced as pain lanced through his ribs. His body screamed for rest, but he refused to stop. Not yet. There was still one thing left to do. He walked slowly through the station, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Every officer he passed gave him a respectful nod, their expressions a mix of concern and admiration. They had seen him return to the station, bloodied and bruised, but unwavering in his resolve. Now they watched him walk with purpose, understanding that this wasn't just about enforcing the law. This was personal. Finally, Jerome reached the holding cells. His gaze locked onto the two men sitting inside. Grant and Harper looked up, their faces filled with a mix of fear and shame. They were no longer the smug, arrogant officers who had left him for dead. Now they were simply two men who had realized the depth of the hole they had dug for themselves. Jerome stood silently for a moment, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to confront the men who had betrayed everything the badge stood for. The men sitting in the holding cell were no longer the arrogant, aggressive officers who had left Jerome Hayes battered and humiliated on the roadside. Now they were small, fearful, and utterly defeated. Their cowering forms brought Jerome no satisfaction, only a cold sense of finality. He approached the cell slowly, his sharp gaze fixed on them. Grant, the taller of the two and the one who had been most aggressive, shifted uncomfortably under Jerome's unwavering stare. His face was pale and his eyes darted nervously around the room, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "Chief," Grant stammered, his voice trembling. "We didn't know. We didn't." Jerome silenced him with a single, cutting look. "You didn't know?" Jerome repeated, his voice low and simmering with barely restrained fury. "You didn't know who I was when you dragged me out of my car? You didn't know when you broke my arm? When you torched my car?" Grant's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His partner Harper sat frozen, staring blankly at the floor with wide, terrified eyes. Jerome stepped closer to the bars, his imposing presence casting a long shadow over the men. "You didn't care who I was," Jerome said, his voice cold and deliberate. "You saw a black man and thought you could get away with it. You thought you could beat me, humiliate me, and leave me to die. And you thought no one would ever know." Grant swallowed hard, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the bench beneath him. "Chief, we made a mistake," he managed, his voice barely audible. Jerome's eyes narrowed. His tone was sharp and unforgiving. "A mistake?" He shook his head slowly. "No, a mistake is forgetting to file a report. What you did was deliberate. You knew exactly what you were doing." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of Jerome's words pressing down like a storm cloud. Grant and Harper shifted nervously, the reality of their actions sinking in with crushing force. Jerome stepped back from the cell, his expression cold and unreadable. "You will pay for what you've done," he said, his voice hard as steel. "I'm going to make sure you never wear a badge again, and I'll make sure you can't even get a job cleaning floors in this town. You're finished." Grant's face crumpled, the last of his bravado dissolving into raw fear. "Please, Chief." But Jerome cut him off again, uninterested in their pleas. He turned to the officers standing nearby and nodded toward the cell. "Take them to the briefing room," he ordered. "I want everyone to see what happens when you betray this department." The officers moved quickly, unlocking the cell and pulling Grant and Harper to their feet. The two men didn't resist. Their fear was palpable as they were led out of the holding area and down the hall. Jerome followed closely behind, his face grim and resolute. When they reached the briefing room, the entire department was gathered, waiting in tense silence. Every officer turned to watch as Jerome entered, followed by the two disgraced men. All eyes were on him as he made his way to the front of the room, standing tall despite the pain coursing through his battered body. Grant and Harper were forced to stand beside him, their heads hanging low in shame. "This department has always stood for justice," Jerome began, his voice steady and firm, echoing through the room. "We are here to serve and protect, not to abuse our power. These two men violated that trust. They attacked me, their own chief, because they thought they could get away with it. They thought no one would hold them accountable." The room remained silent, the tension thick and unrelenting. Every officer was on edge, their respect and fear for their chief evident. Jerome turned to the two men, his gaze icy and unrelenting. "You are no longer police officers," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You will never wear a badge again, and I will personally make sure no department in this country ever hires you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over them and the room. "But that's not all," Jerome Hayes said, his tone cold and resolute as he addressed the disgraced officers. "You're going to buy me a new car, exactly like the one you destroyed, and you'll pay for it out of your own pockets." Grant, the taller of the two, looked up with a pale, stricken expression. We can't afford that," he stammered. Jerome's eyes narrowed, his voice merciless. "You'll find a way," he snapped. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your lives paying for it in other ways." The room fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. Every officer present stood frozen, their eyes locked on their chief, as he stepped forward, standing inches from the two men. In a voice low and dangerous, Jerome leaned in and said, "I'm giving you one chance to make this right. But don't mistake this for mercy. You'll live the rest of your lives knowing that you crossed the wrong man." With deliberate slowness, Jerome raised his good hand and delivered a sharp, stinging slap across Grant's face. The sound echoed through the room, leaving Grant flinching, his face red with humiliation. Jerome turned to Harper next, meeting his wide, fearful eyes. Without hesitation, he delivered the same slap, the blow heavy with disdain. Harper's head snapped to the side, his shame visible to everyone in the room. "Get out of my sight," Jerome said coldly. "You're finished." The two men were led out of the room by officers, their heads bowed low in utter defeat. The rest of the department remained silent, the tension thick as Jerome turned to face them. He didn't need to say another word. The message had been delivered loud and clear. Justice had been served, and the consequences had been swift. Outside the Windale police station, Jerome stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. The cool night air pressed against his bruised body, offering a stark contrast to the fire still burning in his chest. He had done what needed to be done. Grant and Harper were stripped of their power, humiliated before their peers, and cast out of the department. But even with justice served, Jerome knew this wasn't the end. The physical pain from his injuries was nothing compared to the deeper wound of their betrayal. He had spent years building this department, working tirelessly to earn the respect of his officers and to prove he could lead with fairness and integrity. And in one night, two of his own had torn that trust apart. Jerome's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. "Chief," came the familiar voice of Lieutenant Morales, quiet and steady. "The paperwork's done. They've been officially removed from the force. They won't be coming back." Jerome nodded slowly but didn't respond immediately. The weight of the night pressed heavily on him, an invisible burden he carried alone. Despite their punishment, the anger simmering inside him refused to be quelled. It wasn't enough. "I know you did what you had to do," Morales continued, stepping closer. "But you need to rest, sir. You're badly hurt. You should be at the hospital." Finally, Jerome turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried the quiet authority of a man far from finished. "There'll be time for that later," he said, his tone hoarse from the night's events. "Right now, I need to make sure this department understands that what happened tonight will never be tolerated again." Morales sighed, his concern evident. "They know, Chief. Everyone saw what happened in that briefing room. They won't forget it." Jerome glanced down at his hands, his knuckles raw and sore from striking the officers. The fleeting satisfaction of their humiliation had dulled, leaving only a hollow ache in its place. "It's not just about them," Jerome said, his voice tight with restrained emotion. "Those two weren't just rogue officers. They were a symptom of something bigger. Something I've been trying to fight my entire career." Morales remained silent, letting Jerome continue. "This isn't just about me. It's about the culture. The arrogance. The belief that power gives you the right to destroy others without consequence," Jerome said, his gaze distant but sharp. "That's what I've been trying to fix. And tonight shows me just how far we still have to go." Morales nodded slowly, understanding the deeper truth behind his chief's words. But he could see the toll the night had taken. "You don't have to do this alone, sir," he said softly. Jerome turned back toward the station, his shoulders heavy with the weight of leadership, but his resolve unshaken. "No, I don't," he said quietly, "but it's my responsibility to make sure it's done." The fight wasn't over, and Jerome Hayes was ready for whatever came next. "I've spent years trying to build trust, trying to prove that I deserve this position," Jerome Hayes said, his gaze distant, his voice heavy with the weight of reflection. But to some people, it doesn't matter what I've done or what I stand for. To them, I'm still just. His voice trailed off, but the unspoken words lingered in the air, their meaning clear and undeniable. Lieutenant Morales shifted uncomfortably, clearly understanding the deeper implications of Jerome's statement. Sir, we all respect you. This department respects you. What those two did, Grant and Harper, that doesn't represent the rest of us. Jerome finally looked at him, his eyes sharp and unwavering. Maybe not, he said, his tone firm. But they thought they could get away with it. And that's the problem. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken frustration. Jerome knew the issue of racism and abuse of power went far beyond the actions of two men. It was embedded in the culture, in the way certain officers viewed their authority and the people they were sworn to serve. It was a systemic flaw, and it wouldn't be fixed overnight. But that didn't mean he wouldn't try. This department needs to change, Jerome said, more to himself than to Morales. It needs to be better. I need to be better. Morales frowned, his concern deepening. Sir, you've already done more for this department than anyone else ever could. You've led with integrity, with strength. What happened tonight wasn't your fault. Jerome shook his head, bitterness creeping into his voice. Maybe not, he replied, but it's my responsibility to make sure it never happens again. He turned away, his eyes falling on the quiet, empty streets of Windale. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on him, the responsibility of preventing future injustices feeling like an impossible burden. But Jerome knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. The two officers were gone, stripped of their power, but their actions had left a scar that wouldn't heal easily. Jerome had seen firsthand how thin the line was between law enforcement and abuse of authority. He was determined to ensure that line was never crossed again. Not under his watch. Starting tomorrow, Jerome said, his voice resolute, we're implementing new training for every officer in this department. Cultural sensitivity, use of force, accountability, everything. And anyone who refuses to take it seriously will be out. No exceptions. Morales nodded slowly. He wasn't surprised by Jerome's decision, but the gravity of it was clear. I'll get the details organized first thing in the morning, Morales said. Jerome gave a short nod, satisfied that the plan was already in motion. But there was one more thing he needed to address. I want them to pay for my car, Jerome said, his voice cold and unyielding. Every last cent. Morales raised an eyebrow but didn't question the order. I'll make sure that happens, he said. And after that, Jerome continued, his tone hardening further, they're done. They won't work in law enforcement again. I'll make sure of it. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation heavy in the air. Jerome's mind raced, already planning the next steps. The changes that needed to be made were just beginning to take shape in his thoughts. Finally, Morales spoke again, his voice softer this time. Chief, you've been through hell tonight. You need to rest. Jerome sighed, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. He had pushed himself far beyond his limits and his body was screaming for relief. But his mind refused to let him stop. Not yet. I'll rest when this is done, Jerome said firmly, though deep down he knew the battle was far from over. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he had no choice but to keep going. Morales nodded, a small but understanding gesture. Take care of yourself, Chief. We need you. With that, Morales turned and walked away, leaving Jerome alone under the quiet night sky. Jerome remained standing outside the station for a long time, his thoughts swirling with everything that had happened. The betrayal, the pain, the humiliation. It was all still fresh, but so was his resolve. This wasn't just about justice for himself. It was about changing the culture of the department he had spent years building. And though the burden felt impossibly heavy, Jerome Hayes knew he was strong enough to carry it. Jerome Hayes knew that the two rogue officers had paid a steep price for their actions. Their careers were over, their reputations in ruins. But Jerome also understood that the deeper issues still remained. The fight against systemic racism and abuse of power wasn't a battle that could be won in a single night. It was a long, grueling struggle, one that required unwavering commitment and strength. As Jerome finally turned back toward the police station, his body ached with every step. His injuries throbbed with each movement, but they were a reminder of the fight he had just endured, a fight he wasn't willing to abandon. He knew one thing for certain: the battle was far from over. But giving up was not an option. Not now. Not ever. Jerome stood outside the Windale police station, battered but unbroken. Justice had been served. The two men who had humiliated and brutalized him were disgraced, fired, and would never wear a badge again. Yet, as satisfying as that victory was, Jerome understood it wasn't the end of the story. His mission was clear now: rebuild the trust that had been fractured, reform the department he had worked so hard to lead, and ensure that no one else would ever suffer the same fate he had. Jerome stared into the night, the quiet streets of the town stretching out before him. The weight of the responsibility ahead was heavy, but his resolve burned brighter than ever. This wasn't just about punishing two men. It was about dismantling the attitudes and culture that had allowed them to act with such cruelty and arrogance in the first place. He straightened his shoulders, ignoring the pain that flared through his body. There was no room for weakness, not in this fight. This was only the beginning. If you found Jerome Hayes' story powerful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter.